Welcome to the Macdownunder Podcast for all Australian Apple computer enthusiasts and collectors.
Welcome to episode 34 of the Macdownunder Podcast. I'm Justin, and thanks for joining me today to continue our series looking at Apple's external storage devices. We started last week looking at 5.25-inch disk drives, and today we'll look at the 3.5-inch disk drives that Apple released. We'll also cover regular collecting news, coming events, and where you can find some 3.5-inch floppy drives for your collection. So, on to today's episode. Last week we covered the 5.25-inch disk drives that were first released in 1978, with only 113 3/4 kilobytes of storage originally, and based on the Shugart SA400 mechanism. Almost immediately, according to the Apple history books, Apple started developing their own high-capacity disk drive. What we now know as the Twiggy disks, which were 871 kilobytes and included in the Lisa one in 1983. We did cover this last week. They were double-headed, double-sided and high density. As we discussed, there are plans to make these drives available for the Apple II and III. They were going to have unifile and duofile models of these external devices. And some of the famous Macintosh prototypes even have an internal FileWare drive in them. But the Twiggies, when they went into development, had so many problems that they were scrapped and replaced with the Sony 3.5-inch disk drive, creating the Lisa 2 in January 1984, alongside the release of the Macintosh that included the same disk drive. So a little later in May 1984, Apple released the external 400K drive to join the Macintosh, as was originally announced. And here's an example of that drive. The case design was made beige and designed to match the original Macintosh. The Macintosh, of course, can only support one drive, and so there is no daisy chaining on this particular disk drive. But you can add a hard drive that does allow daisy chaining, or HD20 we'll talk about in a future episode. So the 500K drive will work on any Macintosh that doesn't have the SuperDrive high-density double-side controller, because there's some electrical differences in the connection. And this will not work on any Apple II, III or Lisa. So these were single-sided drives, and the standard at the time was a MFM 80 tracks, giving 360 kilobytes. But Apple did their usual thing and customized it, and instead of using the standard MFM encoding, used their own group-coded recording scheme, which allowed for variable sectors on each track depending on the distance away from the centre, which meant that they could fit 400Ks onto the disk drive, and in fact it was more reliable because there were less sectors on the internal tracks. Now, I forgot to talk about disk swapping last week. And that was absolutely a feature of the Apple II and III with their 5.25-inch disk drives. But even these larger 400K drives with the sophisticated operating system for the Macintosh still required a fair bit of disk swapping, hence this external drive. In September 1985, Apple released their first 800K drive, and it was this drive, the Unidisc 3.5. Now that's not to be confused with the Unidisc drive that we talked about last week, which was their first Unidisc drive, which was 5.25-inch for the Apple II. This one's the Unidisc 3.5. Now, surprisingly, this was released initially for the Apple II, using Sony's new 800K double-sided drive mechanism. The reason was to do with the Macintosh file system used on the original Macintosh. It didn't allow for a hierarchy of files. So when you started getting a larger size drive, the 800K, twice the capacity of the original 3.5-inch disk drive, Apple needed to develop a hierarchical file system. They already had that for the Apple II in the form of ProDOS. They had it in the Apple III in the form of the sophisticated operating system. They even had it on the Lisa, but they didn't have it on the Mac. So the first 800K drive was for the Apple II. Now, it contained some additional circuitry to work with the Apple II because, of course, the Apple II was limited to 1 megahertz in its CPU. So it had its own CPU. In fact, it had its own 6502 processor, an IWM chip, which we'll talk about later. It had its own RAM and its own firmware. So it really was a computer in a disk drive. This made it incompatible with the Macintosh. So whereas the original Macintosh 400K drive can't be used with an Apple II, this Apple II UNIF drive 3.5 couldn't be used on a Macintosh. And it was also slowed down specifically for that 1 megahertz processor in the Apple II. So it is a very slow drive compared to some of the things that came later with the same mechanism. In terms of the case, it's in the same Snow White design as the Apple IIc, because this was designed to plug into the Apple IIc disk port, but it did allow for daisy chaining. So on your Apple IIc, you could connect this to the IIc and then connect your 5 1/4 inch disk drive to this and daisy chain them into your Apple IIc. It could also, and on the Apple IIc, you had to update the ROM. The original version, which is ROM 255, when you peak the appropriate area, you needed to upgrade it to a 0 or better version of the ROM to enable the smart port for this particular connector. Now, it would work on the Apple IIgs when it came out. It plugged straight in, but it was slower than the drive designed for the Apple IIgs. And you could use it in a Apple II or Apple II Plus, and potentially in an Apple IIe, provided you had this particular disk drive interface card called the Lorian card. Interestingly, that's not written anywhere on the board, but the ASCO is. So this is the interface for an Apple II if you want to use this particular Unidisc. Apple did develop a duo disc, so a double-headed version of this, but it was never released. And the reason was they found that the original Apple II users didn't really take to the 800K drive, so they weren't selling multiple units. So there wasn't a business case to release the double version of this particular disk drive, unlike the 5 1/4 inch disk drives that were so small capacity that the duo disc with two 5.25 inch drives was in fact a commercial viability. Now, I've only used the 3.5 inch Unidisc drive recently when I was preparing some Apple IIcs for an exhibition. And I think I would have liked it back in the day because you can load so many pieces of software under ProDOS 8 on this particular disk drive. I would have loved it when I was doing my university papers to store all of my research files on the one semi-rigid floppy disk. So whilst it's slow, it's still faster, I think, than using multiple 5 1/4 inch disk drives and having to do the swap backwards and forwards. And of course, you can daisy chain it off the back of your Apple IIc and then allow a 5 1/4 inch disk drive as well. In 1986, alongside the release of the Macintosh Plus, we finally got the Macintosh 800K external drive, and here's an example of that. It was slimmer than the original 400K Macintosh drive because of the smaller mechanism, but in the same beige to match the Mac Plus. Again, it's a double-sided disk drive using the same mechanism as the Unidisc, but this used the group-coded recording again. So that meant that instead of the industry standard of 720K in a 3.5 inch disk drive, the max 800K disk drive allowed you to use obviously more capacity. This particular model can be used with all Macintosh except for the original 128K because the 400K disks in them just can't hold the operating system plus the required initialization for this drive. However, if you use a hard disk 20, it contains the firmware that can be loaded into RAM to operate this drive. So you can use it on a Mac 128K or 512, but you need the HD20 as a daisy chain in order to load the software for this to work. Although it did support the older 400K single-sided disks. As we said before, for various reasons, this is electrically different to the UniFile, so this drive can't be used on the Apple II. Now, I've not had much experience with this drive because I wasn't using a Mac Plus at the time, and I skipped this one. In September 1986, Apple released the Apple 3.5-inch drive. So it finally adopted a unified cross-platform product, essentially eliminating this only works with Apple II, that only works with the Macintosh problem that we've seen to date. So it does in fact use the same internal Sony mechanism as an 800K drive using the GCF formatting system. Again, adopting the Snow White appearance, very much like the Unifile that we saw for the Apple II, but in platinum, because this got released alongside the Apple II GS, which again used the Snow White design language and was the first Apple product in platinum. So this one works on the Apple II GS as well as the Macintosh, and like the Unidisc 3.5 and the Apple 3.5 drive includes Apple II specific features. So it's got an eject button, which the Macintosh versions of the drive didn't have, and it's got the daisy chain connector. In fact, this one's still got its patch on it, but it does have the daisy chain connector like the other Apple II drives, remembering the Macintosh drives did not. And once the Mac SE was released the following year in 1987, you could daisy chain 3 of these to your Mac SE or your Mac II. It could even be used on the Mac 128K or 512, but only, of course, for the 400K disks that those particular computers used. So this drive worked with the Apple II GS, the Apple IIc Plus, and in an Apple II with a disk drive card. So a different one. This is the Apple 3.5-inch disk drive interface card that allows use of this drive and some that will follow, but not the Lorion card. So it can't be used, the Apple 3.5 drive in platinum can't be used on a standard Apple IIc or with the Lorion card. It's just not compatible with those. Now, I've used these drives a lot. My Apple II GS, which was one of the machines I used back in the day, came with one of these. I very quickly got a second one, and it was great for 8-bit ProDOS, so standard Apple II ProDOS, because you could put so many files, applications, games, and other things on the one disk. 16-bit ProDOS that originally came out with the first version of the Apple II GS also allowed you to boot the operating system and software on your Apple II GS, but you did need to do a bit of disk swapping for data files. But the Apple II GS OS, the operating system, really can't be used on a single disk, not easily, and it does take multiple disk swaps to install the GS OS and most of the GS OS applications that were common in the day. So still a bit of disk swapping with the 800K drive, but this Apple 3.5-inch drive finally had compatibility between both the Apple II and the Macintosh. Now, fast forward to 1989, and Sony had released a high-density double-sided drive. So, as the label suggests on the front, it was originally labelled the FDHD for floppy disk high density. Later, it was relabelled as the Super Drive, but no DVD burning on this one. I'll show you that one in a moment. But with this drive, Apple moved away from that group coding recording idea that they were using specifically for their 800K and 400K drives, because Sony and IBM had developed this high density drive that could take 1.44 megabytes of storage using a modified frequency modulation formatting scheme. Now, this meant that you got 1.44 megabytes. It was double-sided high density. It supported all of Apple's 3.5-inch floppy disk formats, so you could still read and write a 400K disk on it, as well as all of the other PC standards, so MS-DOS and Windows. So this was really the first absolutely cross-platform drive that Apple released. It used the same case as the original 3.5-inch drive, but internally had additional shielding. So you can obviously tell the difference because it's got FD-HD written on the front, and on the back it's got the same thing on the label. So to take advantage of this drive's extended storage, you now needed a swim chip. So the Sander Wozniak integrated machine. I actually thought it was the Super Wozniak integrated machine. However, Wikipedia tells me otherwise. And it needed that on the floppy controller chip present on the Macintosh or the Apple II. So for the Mac SE, there was an upgrade available. And for the Mac 2, there was an upgrade available that allowed you to use the FD-HD. And anything after that used super disks automatically. In the Apple II, you required this 3.5-inch disk controller card. So in fact, this disk controller card that I showed previously was actually designed for these high-density drives, but would also then allow you to use the Apple 3.5 drive in your Apple II. So if this drive was connected to an older Macintosh or directly connected to an Apple II GS or a Apple IIc Plus with the older integrated WOS machine chip, it would still operate, but only at 800K. You needed that swim chip with the newer hardware to access the 1.44 megs. Now, I've used this, but by the time the drive came out, most systems had hard disk drives, and so the need for disk swapping really wasn't there. Almost everything got installed into your hard drive. When these did come in handy is when you're installing operating systems or software, because there was still disk swapping needed for those. Now, this is the FD-HD version. There's also the SuperDisk version. Now, I've not seen one with SuperDisk written on the front. There's documentation that suggests they exist, but I've not found one. How you tell with these is it says Apple SuperDrive on the bottom, and if you take it apart, it has the additional shielding inside. Now, a tip if you're buying one, if it doesn't have the label on the back and it doesn't have the interior shielding, but reads 1.44 meg disks, that's because the mechanism's been swapped out aftermarket by somebody. Now, they're not the only 1.44 meg disk drives that are around. Apple also released this disk drive to go with the PowerBook series, in particular the PowerBook 100, a couple of the others, as well as the Duo docks. So it's the same Sony mechanism, but it's now in a much smaller case, designed and color-coded to match the PowerBook, and it's got this flap on the front to protect the disk drive door, which in fact operates as a stand as well. Now, these contained a slightly lower powered version of the SuperDrive, which meant that with this special HDI 20 connector, it was powered directly from the laptop. I've only really ever used these on my PowerBook 100 to install software, and when I've got another PowerBook with the HDI 20 connector, that the internal disk drive wasn't working. But otherwise, I've not had much experience with these. There's also a very unique 3.5-inch disk drive. This particular model, which was designed specifically for the PowerBook 2400C, only released in Japan. Again, it's got the low-powered SuperDrive in it, but you'll notice that it's got this very curved appearance in the PowerBook dark grey, designed specifically to blend in with the PowerBook 2400C. It does still have a drive door protector that operates as a stand, but this particular model comes with a Molex connector, which is unique for this particular disk drive, and is also used on the IBM ThinkPads of the era, remembering that the PowerBook 2400C and this disk drive were designed by IBM. However, even though it's got the same connectors, they are not the same drives as the IBM drives. They don't work with your Macintosh. This was the last external disk drive to be manufactured by Apple and was discontinued in 1998. This one in particular, I can't say that I've ever used it. I got it as part of my collection, but I don't think I've ever put a disc in it. So on to maintenance of these disk drives. So they're all fairly old by now, and so all of these disk drives are going to need the disk drive heads cleaned. Now ideally you'd do this with a disk cleaning disc. Hard to come by now, but basically they've replaced the magnetic media with a cleaning surface that you can put some liquid on, and that's the best way to clean your disk drives. If you do need to take your disk drives apart to clean the heads, be very careful not to bend the mechanism where the disk head is attached, because they're sprung and they are in a particular position. And if you change the tension on the spring or bend the spring, they may not align again. The mechanisms will need cleaning, so the physical mechanism will need cleaning and light lubrication, but remember that circuits don't like oil, so limit the amount of lubrication you use, and usually slightly thicker lubrication directly on those points of movement. And the 800K drives, and I believe also the super drives, suffer from gear failures as well. Often described as cheese and they fall apart, they'll likely need replacement. And in fact, in the for sale section, there's a drive that probably has this problem. So, have you got any Apple 3.5-inch disk drives in your collection? Are you still using them? I still use mine for installing software. Which one's your favourite? Let us know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. So, on to recent news, and first up, Mac of all trades on Tinker Different announced the release of Macdoom for the Mac SE30. So Retrospect Mike at GitHub has made his software available. I'll put the link down in the description, go and take a look. Next up, the xDrive 2C mass storage solution for the Apple IIc Launch Edition has been made available through MacFX. Some of the features include, you've got fast floppy and hard drive emulation for ProDOS volumes inside your Apple IIc, support for all the usual file formats and images. There's a sidecar unit, so you need to have a look at the website, that mounts under the external part of your Apple IIc that allows you to swap your USB or SD cards. It easily installs, they tell me, into the CPU socket for fast and reliable access. So take a look in the description. It is a commercial product. At the moment, I think only available from the US, but it sounds really exciting. Next up, back on March 10th. So in fact, last week, just after I finished recording the last episode, I got a message about this, and it was the announcement that David Pogue's new book, Apple's First 50 Years, has been released. And so links down in the description. David also hosted the Computer History Museum celebration for Apple's 50th anniversary. A little bit early because I think it's on April 1st actually, technically, but he also hosted that event, which happened last week. So sorry that we all missed out on that, but I only found out pretty much the night before, straight after posting my last podcast. And last up, just a roundup of the Train and Hobby Show last weekend. It was a huge weekend, and I visited on the Saturday afternoon. I caught up with Matt and his daughter from the Mac Museum, and as you can see in the photo, he had an Apple IIe running Donkey Kong, which was really popular, an Apple III running its demo program, a Mac Plus running a few different games, which also seemed pretty popular when I was there, an Apple eMate that a few people were playing with when I was there, and he had 3 iMacs running a network version of Marathon, and quite a few people were having a go at that. He also had a Power Mac G4 with the OS X beta running, and he said it was rock solid, lasted all day without needing a reboot, unlike his iMac G4 with OS X 10.1, which apparently needed rebooting a couple of times. But it was a great display, as you can see in the photo. Declan, who's also a friend of the podcast and a friend of the museum, also was displaying some Apple computers at the Train and Hobby Show. And he had a theme of the Snow White design language, which was great. And as you can see in the photo, he had an Apple IIc, he had an Apple IIgs, which were very early adopters of the Snow White design language. He had the Mac SE and a beautiful Mac 2, which was just running superbly. And he also had some history about the Snow White design there. It was great to see two of our regular contributors to the podcast and down at the museum with their displays, alongside all sorts of other hobbies and other retro computing equipment. There was some huge IBM and Data General mainframes and mini computers there as well. So it was a great event. So if you get to go along next year, I'd highly recommend it. So on to coming events. First up, the Adelaide Retro Computing Group have their next meeting on Friday the 10th of April in the usual place, link down in the description. Retro Gaming Bendigo, again, have their second meeting for March on Sunday the 29th of March from 12:30 until 1. Again, they've moved to the Huntley Memorial Hall in Huntley on the Midland Highway. Check the information in the description. WozFest 43 is scheduled for the 28th of March to celebrate Apple's 50th anniversary. Again, check the link down in the description. This is in a private home, so remember to make contact with the organisers to get all the details. Technology markets have a few dates announced, but the next one's Sunday the 22nd of March at the Springers Leisure Centre in Keysborough. I don't think it's a retro display. Nevertheless, there'll be spare parts and other things to purchase from them if you go there. Again, link in the description. And last and not least, as usual, the Mac Museum is open each Saturday for the rest of March. So that's another 2 meetings. Little Bird has suggested to me that the Mac Museum is probably not open over Easter, but watch the Mac Museum website for details. But for the next 2 weeks, open from 10 until 2 in the afternoon, with the enthusiast meetings being the first meeting of the month. I reckon the next one will be in May. Stay tuned. Have a look at the Mac Museum website. Onto the for sale section. So this week I've looked for 3.5-inch disk drives, go figure. But strangely, they were much harder to find than the 5.25-inch disk drives, which were older when I checked last week. So first up, we have a vintage Unidisc 3.5 disk drive in Victoria for $365. Now it's pretty expensive, but these things are pretty rare. And also, we happen to know the vendor in this case, and they have tremendous work. So $365, you almost get a guarantee that this thing's going to work if this is what you want. Next up, we have an 800K external floppy drive. Now this is the Mac version. And I've got to point out that there is no reading on this particular disk drive. So it does have some issues. But there aren't any others available online at the moment in Australia as far as I can see. So if you want one of those very early 800K disk drives for the Macintosh, this one's $65, pretty cheap given it doesn't read, and available in Victoria. Next up, we have that universal 3.5-inch disk drive that came out with the Apple IIgs, again 800K. Now, this one has issues, it won't eject. But if you remember earlier, this is a pretty common problem, and it's usually one of the gears that's gone cheesy and broken. So that's quite possibly what the problem is here. The price is a little bit higher. It's $120 again in Victoria. Next up, now there's a few of these available online. I've only chosen one of them, and this is the PowerBook Super Drive with the HDI 20 connector. This one reads and appears to be working, although it's being sold as parts, very cheap at $49 from Victoria. And last up, not an Apple product, but given everything else we've talked about with the problems with these drives over the years, I thought this might be worthwhile. So this is the replacement floppy drive eject gear. In fact, it's 3 of them in a bundle for $19.95. The ad actually, if you link it to the ad, it's got some great photos of exactly what happens to this cog or this gear and how to fit the replacement. So if you want to understand the problem and how difficult it might be, have a look at the ad. There are some great photos in there. Now, I need to point out this one's in New South Wales for $19.95. You can get these from overseas, but shipping at the moment is enormous. So I don't think this is a bad deal. $19.95 for 3 of these gears from New South Wales. Well, that brings us to the end of episode 34 and our discussion on Apple's 3.5-inch disk drives. Please let me know what you thought down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I am planning to start covering Apple's external hard disk drives next week. Is that a good idea? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And also don't forget to visit the Mac Museum over any of the next 2 weekends in March between 10 until 2. Again, watch the website. I think they might be closed on Easter, and have a look to see what they're doing after that. Well, thanks again for joining me today. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Until next time, take care. Thank you for joining the Macdownunder Podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.